Classical mythologies have shaped the very world we live in.
Yeah, whatever. I don't have time for dense, dusty old books, Paul.
Great. Well, that's what podcasts are for.
Oh, good point.
Join me, Paul, as I teach my best friend and improv comedy partner, Sarah, all about mythology on Myth Understood.
Mythology is frequently explicit, obscene, violent, and bizarre, though, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to joke about and improvise along the way?
Yes.
Oh.
So come for the mythology and stay for the absurdity on Myth Understood.
Available now at mythunderstoodpodcast.com and your podcast platform of choice.
It's Myth Understood.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back to Don't Quill the Messenger and another exciting episode today. We welcome back to the program Professor of Theatre at York University in Toronto, Canada, and series editor of the 6-volume World Encyclopedia of Contemporary Theatre, our special guest, Don Rubin. Welcome, Don.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Lovely to be with you.
So good to have you back after our previous episode featuring Bonner Miller Cutting and our discussion of Shakespeare's Will. But today we're here to talk about something completely different. What many people maybe don't know about you is that beyond being a professor of theater and an editor of an encyclopedia of theater, you are also a renowned theater critic. Isn't that so?
Well, if you want to embarrass me right off the top, yes.
Well, the reason I bring that up because I do believe that it is your affiliation as a professional critic that led to one of the topics that we want to discuss today, which is the special edition of Critical Stages that recently was produced and published that involved everything to do with the Shakespeare authorship question.
Yes. Critical Stages is a web journal, and if anybody is curious about it, it's critical-stages.org. It's a free web journal. It's getting about 20,000 hits a month worldwide. When I last checked, there were over 120 countries that had readers in over 120 countries. So people are paying attention to Critical Stages. It's been going for about 5 or 6 years, and I have been the managing editor of the journal for most of that time. And as you can imagine, my interest in Shakespeare sneaks into the journal. For instance, Stephen, you mentioned that I was the editor of the World Encyclopedia of Contemporary Theatre. Do you know who the most produced playwright in the contemporary theatre is?
Let me take a really
wild guess.
Crazy guess and say it is the Bard himself.
Yes, it's the Bard himself, whoever he was. I found that amazing as I was studying theater in 160 different countries worldwide since World War II. And I found everyone, everywhere, is producing the works of William Shakespeare. And I started that project back in the mid-90s, and it completed its 6 volumes in 2000. And I became more and more interested in the question of why Shakespeare's works remained relevant around the world. And I stumbled into the whole question of who actually was writing behind the name William Shakespeare. And I read a wonderful book written by Mark Anderson that you know called Shakespeare by Another Name. It's a biography of one of the possible candidates, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And I couldn't put that book down. It was like a mystery story. It just, I found it absolutely fascinating. And so for the last 15 years or so, I have been researching this question of who was writing behind what I now believe was the pseudonym William Shakespeare. So I proposed a whole issue on this topic of this web journal, Critical Stages.
How was that received? Who do you propose that to, and how was that received? And tell us a little bit about how that all came to pass.
Well, Critical Stages comes out about 3 times a year. It's published by an organization out of Paris, France, called the International Association of Theater Critics. There are about 70 or 80 national centers. Each center represents between 25 and 100 theater critics and theater scholars in those countries. So if you multiply that out, there's thousands of opinion makers around the world who are in that organization. The International Association of Theater Critics uses Critical Stages as an outlet for critical writing among its members. It's open to anybody to write for the journal. The publisher, as I say, is the International Association of Theater Critics in Paris. The executive editor, well, I should say the editor, general editor of the publication is a man named Savas Patsalidis from Aristotle University in Greece, a wonderful multilingual scholar of theater and literature. And the executive editor, because Savas is the general editor, the executive editor is at the University of Chicago, a man named Jeffrey Eric Jenkins. He's been the chair of the University of Chicago at Urbana, Champaign for a number of years. I believe he's just stepped down from that position. And I'm the managing editor. I'm based in Toronto, and we have a staff of regular freelancers who write from all over the world. So it's an interesting international publication, truly international in that sense. And so when we put something out, we get responses all over the world. Now, you asked, what was the response when I proposed this? I proposed this to the 2 other editors, the series editor and the executive editor, and they both said, "We know you're interested in this topic. We don't know a lot about it. Why don't you propose some specific articles and some specific writers and let us take a look?" I put together a detailed proposal for them. They both read it. It included material from Mark Rylance, Derek Jacobi, the American scholar Diana Price. There was some extraordinary people who were contributing to this. And they looked at it and they read a few of the pieces and they said, "Wow, we are very interested." So I was much relieved. They
didn't tar and feather you and
No.
run you out of town?
No, very open. The tar and feathering came later, but they were very open to the idea. They thought that the authorship question is something that the journal has never dealt with, and apparently I gave them enough preliminary material that they became fascinated by it. Once they gave the go-ahead, we were supposed to publish it about this, sometime in late 2017. I gave them all the finished material. They looked at it and they said, "Wow, this is terrific. Can you get us 1 or 2 more pieces?" I said, of course I can get you more material. And they said, "We want to devote a whole special section of the journal to this, not just a few essays." And so I expanded it. The material finally came out in, I guess it was March of 2018. In issue 18. So if anybody goes online, it's critical-stages.org. And when you get there, you'll be at issue 18. It's the current issue. But if it's not right there, just look, hit issue 18, move back to issue 18. And then within that issue, you will find that each issue is a big issue, is about 200 to 300 pages of material. So you look for the special topics section. We are special topics 2, called The Question That Won't Go Away. Did the man from Stratford really write the plays?
Who chose that title, the question that won't go away?
I did, and I was using that right from the beginning of my proposal. I know that there's a lot of people who would like that question to go away, who don't want to deal with that question, whether they were in academe or in journalism. But I felt that the question that won't go away was appropriate, and the editors liked it. The issue came out, and I have been getting responses to the issue over the last several months from a whole lot of people, as you can imagine.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that it was published March of 2019. Is that correct?
2019, sorry, 2019, that's correct. Yeah.
And so when you say the last couple of months, you mean the last couple of months?
Yeah, literally the last couple of months. I have had responses that have ranged from, how dare you publish material like this? Shame on you. The editors have gotten some of these letters as well. In fact, one of the strongest attacks came from a member of the international executive of the International Association of Theater Critics, the publisher. So a member of the executive was very angry that we were even dealing with this material. He actually is not only a well-known theater critic in Serbia, but he's also a very distinguished professor of literature there. And I was shocked that he felt we should not even deal with the material. I can tell you that the theater critic for the national newspaper in Canada cut up his membership card in the International Association of Theater Critics and said if the International Association is going to publish this kind of material in its journals, he wants nothing to do with it. Those are the kind of vituperative responses.
Nice word.
Yeah, I felt, if we can describe these responses as vituperative, it means that we hit a nerve. Something got to people. And it was interesting, Stephen, because the International Association of Theater Critics, the publisher of the journal, then had a long debate among its executive members, including this person from Serbia, and they debated the whole issue. And in the end, they supported the editors, they supported the issue, they supported publishing this material, and they said that the freedom to research and the freedom of opinion to deal with controversial subjects is essential to scholarship and criticism and journalism. And I was very proud of the organization for taking that stand.
It isn't it kind of sad that I mean, obviously, yes, very proud of the organization for taking that stand, but isn't it sad that that's not the norm in the halls of academia, in the halls of journalism? Isn't it sad that we have to applaud and praise that as being unique and extraordinary, as opposed to being the regular approach that you would expect from editors and critics and scholars? And I mean, isn't that the most glaring issue here, I think?
Yeah, I would agree with you totally. There's a Russian poet that many people may know by the name of Yevgeny Yevtushenko. And I remember
you have
one
a
of his
remarkable
poems.
Ability to pronounce these very difficult names.
Yevtushenko was the official dissident during the Soviet Union. He spoke out against what was going on, and people praised him all over the world for his bravery, his nerve to do these things. And he wrote a wonderful poem in which he said, "I simply told the truth. And I was amazed that people called me brave. I wasn't brave. I just told the truth. And that's really what I think is at the heart of this issue. What we're doing here is just reporting on research. We're just telling the truth. I don't think bravery is involved here, but you're absolutely right. It is to look into this issue. One has to brave the arrows of outrageous fortune and all of that these days. To deal with this issue in academe seriously, somebody said to me before I started offering a course on this subject about 5-6 years ago, they said, if you offer this course, it is academic suicide. Well, happily, I had enough tenure that I could withstand it. But yes, there were a lot of attacks. But I must say, whether it was in the university or in this International Association of Theater Critics, there were people who really supported us. There were people who came forward. I can tell you that two of the most interesting notes that I had after this issue, one came from probably Africa's leading playwright, a Nigerian, another difficult name to pronounce. His name is Femi Oshofi-san. And he wrote to me out of the blue after this material on the authorship appeared, and he said, and I'm reading it, your Shakespeare issue is very rich. I haven't read everything yet, but just the introduction is mouth-watering. Now, that's from one of Africa's major playwrights. And then I love this. This came from a dramaturg from Vancouver, and he is a Stratfordian. He has no interest in this whole thing, and he read it, and he wrote to me, I read and I listened to the material online, especially to the material from Diana Price, the American scholar. And he said, and I quote here, and I began to feel conversion coming on.
Wow. Okay, well, there you go. And there's the difference between those who approach the research and what has been and the inquiry with an open mind rather than what I consider to be, in most cases, a very fearful mind.
Yeah. I agree with you totally. One of the other responses that was interesting came from a Shakespearean scholar who studied at the Birmingham Academy, at the Shakespeare Institute, who is now living in Greece, and he read the entire issue, and he wrote a 4 or 5 page letter to me saying how interesting he found the articles and da-da-da-da. And so I wrote back to him and I said to him, you're an academic. Do you teach this material at your university? And he said, no, I don't. I said, why don't you extend the little essay that you've already written and explain why you don't teach it? What stops you? You're very open. What stops you from teaching this? And he wound up doing that. He wrote a 17-page essay, which will be in the next issue of Critical Stages. And it's going to stand on its own as a 17-page essay response to all of our material, exploring why it's such a difficult issue in academe. And he's speaking very clearly about his own questions, his own concerns with this issue.
That's
so
fascinating.
It's continuing.
That is fascinating, and I think it will be fascinating to read. And I think if we could, and I think you've touched on something here that's at the heart of the larger picture when it comes to making some inroads with opening people's minds that more research needs to be conducted, that there are questions that still need to be answered, and that we just don't know for a definitive fact who this author truly was, and we need to get to the bottom of it. And I think that if we could figure out what it is, and maybe we need some like top psychologists I think you could probably write a doctoral thesis about how people respond to this and why they respond with such a visceral and such a angry and fearful reaction. If I think we could define that, we might be able to curb that reaction, help people ease through that initial reaction, and open up to the idea of we're just asking questions here.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. I know there's a few doctors and psychiatrists who are interested in this issue, but I don't think that they are actually exploring why people are so angry when this issue is brought up. I've spoken to a lot of people over the years, and most of the time they don't know much about it. And so when you start explaining it and talking about it, they're interested. But those who seem to know something about the issue get angry. It's as if you're attacking their religion. I must tell you, Stephen, that the best response when I said to somebody, why won't you even open your eyes to this? The only response that I've really said, okay, I accept that totally, came from the critic of The Observer in England, Michael Billington. Very, very respected man. And I've known Michael Billington a long time. And we had lunch together at one point, and I said to him, this is what I've been researching. This is what I've been studying, and I put this information out to you, and you are rejecting it out of hand. You don't even want to hear it. Why? What is it that's stopping you? And he looked at me and he said, you see, I'm from Warwickshire myself. And I come from a poor family, and I want to believe desperately that somebody from a poor family in Warwickshire could be such a genius and become Shakespeare and write the greatest works in the world. I want to believe in that story, and you're challenging my belief. And I looked at him and I said, I accept what you're saying totally. That's the only honest answer I've ever heard to this.
That's I would applaud him at being so candid about it and actually doing some self-examination. And I think that's one of the keys there that you touch on is I think that a big part of this is that it does require people to do some self-examination that they just, quite frankly, are afraid to do or don't want to do. If all that I have been taught about this isn't true, then suddenly what else might not be true? And I'm not willing to look into that. I'm not willing to accept that.
You see, I find it very interesting as a professor of dramatic literature and theater history. I taught for many years a survey of theater history, and I taught during those years all about the man from Stratford, and I taught the traditional story. I had never been told in my years of education and in all the years of my teaching, I had never been told, and I never heard there was a question. Now, there's something wrong with our educational system when that question, and it is a question, it's a real question that Shakespearean scholars know exists, that they don't even bring up the idea that there is a question. I went through all of my teaching doing that, and I didn't even know there was a question. When I finally realized there was a question, I started going back in many of those classes and presenting a series of views. I say, this is the traditional view. This is the questions that come up about the traditional view. And that seems reasonable in a course, on theater history or a literature survey. But you speak to most people, especially in English departments, and they say, I don't even want to bring it up. No, I won't bring it up. I won't let it come up because it's a crazy idea. And then you start to question the people who are saying these things, and they really don't know much about the research that's gone into this area. They just assume if the Stratford Birthplace Trust says this is so, it must be so. If Stanley Wells, the preeminent Shakespearean scholar in the world, says this is so, it must be so. The fact that he's the president of the Stratford Birthplace Trust, which benefits from huge tourism and huge amounts of money coming into Stratford, the fact that this may have something to do with why he says these things, they want to ignore that. We have to break through on so many levels to just get the truth out there. What do you say to students today when you know there's an issue like this? What do you teach? Do you teach the traditional story, which is under attack right now, and those attacks are growing? Or do you open up the issue and say, let's explore this, let's look at this issue? When I was teaching my course in the authorship, which I taught for 4 or 5 years, I didn't say to students at the beginning of the course, I believe that person X wrote the plays of Shakespeare. I started out by saying, there is a question, and I am going to assign groups of 2 or 3 of you. It was a 4th year in graduate course, so I'd have maybe 20 or 22 students in the course, and I would assign them to one of 7 or 8 or 9 possible authors, including Shakespeare, the man from Stratford. And I would ask that group to research their authorship candidate and come to the class and prove in a 3-hour block of time why this person was the author. And then in a 10-minute conclusion, identify the main arguments against your candidate.
Were these randomly assigned, or they got to choose?
Every 3rd student got Shakespeare, and every 2nd student got Oxford, and every 1st student got Bacon, and every so it just handing out all of these possible candidates, and the students loved it because they were actually trying to prove that their person was the author, and then they would listen to all of the other people in the class trying to prove the same thing about somebody else. And then at the very end of the course, I would always have a straw poll, and I said, okay, here's the 7, 8, 9 candidates who we've spoken about this year, and let's put down, let's have a vote. Put down your top 3 candidates, and the candidate who you think really wrote it after listening to everything will get 5 points, and your second choice gets 3 points, and your third choice gets 1 point. And then we added this all up, and it was fascinating. Year after year, Edward de Vere kept winning the straw poll by students who had as their own topic been trying to prove that, say, Marlowe wrote the plays or Bacon wrote the plays. And de Vere came out ahead almost every time, and interestingly, the man from Stratford came near the bottom every time. This is students going into this knowing very little about the subject.
Depending on
students
the student,
going in without an idea, about the authorship question. And by the end of the course, I think they did know a fair amount about the subject, and this was their decision, and I went out of my way not to tell them where I stood on this question. And if we go back to this issue in critical stages, the material I pulled together there, it is not an argument for any particular candidate. It is an introduction to the authorship question, the question that won't go away. Did the man from Stratford really write the plays? And if you look at those 9 major essays that are in there, there's only 2 which even argue for a particular candidate. The other 7 just keep saying, can't we talk reasonably and honestly and openly about this?
Yeah, and I would think in the situation with the class full of students, depending upon the student and their particular study habits and their particular willingness to want to do the work, I would think that you would have some students who would be very happy that they pulled Shakespeare because there isn't enough to do. There isn't very much to do. And if you drew Oxford, you're like, oh man, I have to really put together a really long paper because there's so much evidence here. So it's kind of an unfair assignment, I would say, Professor.
I also said to the students, Stephen, I said, if you have a particular person that you want to do, please make a note of that, and I'll try to give you that person. And I would say that in the 5 iterations of that course that I did, I had maybe 2 or 3 students over the years who wanted to do Shakespeare, and most of the others had no significant background on the authorship issue. But those who wanted to do Shakespeare did Shakespeare. And at the end of the course, over those 5 years, only one of those students maintained that Shakespeare was still the writer. The others all sort of backed off. So it was very interesting to get the student reaction. And when people in my own department said, why are you leading students into this dangerous area of the authorship question? I would say, I'm looking at students who are running around reading Shakespeare's sonnets in 2017 or 2018 or 2019. I have students who are reading Venus and Adonis. I have students looking at Hamlet in detail.
That's so
Is
dangerous.
that such a bad thing?
Oh, it's so
Is that a bad
dangerous.
thing?
A dangerous course you're leading them down into the poetry of Shakespeare. How dare you?
My God, it's a horror. How can you do things like that? I said, how many courses, even in the English department, how many courses are there at the senior undergraduate level or first year graduate level that seriously look into Venus and Adonis or the sonnets or things like that these days? Fewer and fewer courses. So the students are reading Elizabethan literature critically. They're reading it for a purpose, to find information behind the words. And the students love the course, and many of them said it was their favorite course in the whole time they were in the university. So I don't apologize for leading my students astray in this way.
I would be curious to ask those people who used that descriptor, dangerous, what makes it dangerous in their opinion? What do they see as being so dangerous about it, and who makes it dangerous in those ways that they're so fearful of?
It's such a good question, Stephen. I don't understand myself. I can only say that most of the people who challenged my course were in the English department. My colleagues in the theater department, they may have raised an eyebrow or two, but some of them came and sat in on some of the classes and listened and said, it's an interesting discussion. But people in the English department, some of my students were taking theater courses and English courses, and when professors in the English department found out the students were taking an authorship course in the theater department, they said, you should drop out of that course immediately. There's no reason to deal with a subject that doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. It's silly. It's pointless. And when the students said to me, well, I questioned that professor, I asked, why is it silly? They wouldn't even answer. They said, I'm not even going to get into this subject. If you can get people engaged in a serious discussion, if they're not attacking you just for opening up the question, I think that people are interested and are curious. But most of the scholars, particularly in English departments, seem to be totally closed. Shakespearean scholars, Elizabethan scholars, and I suppose it's because their professors, if not themselves, their professors, the people they revered and learned from, have written books and made whole careers proving for themselves that the man from Stratford had to have been the author of these plays. And so now to bring up an alternative, it really shakes the foundation of the education that they've had. And then, of course, Stephen, you know that trends in education have changed as well. And over the last 50 years now, probably, there's been a lot of discussion about the author doesn't matter. Foucault and Barthes and people like that say studying biography, studying the author's life, studying anything other than what is on the page has no meaning.
That's ridiculous. That's absolutely and utterly
of course,
ridiculous.
but this is an educational theory that is very strong and very strong today. It really picked up speed about 50 years ago, and then the theories of Barthes and Foucault followed this. They said the reader is all. Whatever poem you're reading, if it means something to you, that's good. If it doesn't mean anything to you, then that work is a useless work to you. And you say, well, wait a second, what about studying it from a sociological, historical, thematic point of view? No, not at all. The author is dead for many of these theorists, and many students coming through, particularly English departments, are saturated with that point of view.
Of course, because if I read
wrong.
The Grapes of Wrath, it doesn't help me at all in any way to understand Steinbeck's life or the Great Depression or the Great Dust Bowl. Or none of that matters because that didn't have any influence on his writing.
Yeah, absolutely. All we're doing is looking at the words on the page. I mean, in my introduction to this issue of critical stages, I tried to attract people to the question by floating the word imagine. And I said, imagine some extreme possibilities. I said, imagine that a feminist scholar found that the beloved American writer Thornton Wilder was not really the author of Our Town, but had simply allowed his name to be used because the real writer, a woman, felt that her work would not be taken seriously. Impossible? I don't know, but imagine if that were to happen. I said, imagine that a history scholar studying the labor movement in the United States after World War II found out that the black writer Langston Hughes really wrote Death of a Salesman. Not possible? Right. But imagine that the major plays of Tennessee Williams were really written by conservative guru William F. Buckley. Could it be? That's how I started my introduction. And then, the question always comes up, well, would it matter? Even if we were able to prove any of this, would it matter? Would it affect our readings of the plays? Possibly. Or possibly not. I mean, a female author for Our Town, would it have any impact on the plays? A black author for Death of a Salesman? An aggressively right-wing author for the plays of a seriously closeted gay genius like Tennessee Williams? And I pointed out these kind of revelations, even if you could prove it, they wouldn't change the plays. Our Town would still be the ultimate examination of everydayness and appreciating every moment of life, and Death of a Salesman would still be the same attack on capitalism, and Streetcar Named Desire would still be about the struggle of poets to live in a world dominated by apes. Wouldn't they all remain the same? And my argument basically is, of course they would remain the same, because the texts wouldn't change. The same thing with the Shakespeare authorship question. The texts won't change. What would change, however, if this authorship issue could be solved, and we found that it wasn't the man from Stratford. What would change are the contexts behind these plays, the social context, the political context, the sexual context, and what would be revealed ultimately by actors, by directors like you, Stephen, perhaps even by scholars, might well be additional layers of truth in each of these areas. So,
for many
the question
of the
I just kept
greatest,
putting, would it matter?
And for many of the greatest works of literature throughout history, it is context in many cases that makes them great. In some cases, they're not necessarily the best written plays or the most fleshed out characters or the greatest novels, except for the time period they were produced, except for the message that they had to say in the society that they were being presented to. I think in many cases, we wouldn't study certain works of literature if it weren't for the context of them.
Absolutely.
Ennui's Antigone. Right? Is it really the best version of Antigone? I don't necessarily think so. However, I do think that it coming out at the
World
time,
War II has something to do with it.
Absolutely. And when you study it in the context of World War II and in context of the French resistance, now it suddenly becomes a work that you must study, that you need to have as a part of the historical reference of what was happening in society at the time across all levels, including in the halls of artistic creation.
Absolutely. And as people start to look seriously at the issue, at the evidence that's coming out on the authorship side, they're starting to realize that looking seriously at this issue is very far from crackpot. And the whole thing is very far from being a conspiracy issue. The whole authorship issue in Shakespeare studies is one that's literally leading thousands of critics and scholars and theater artists and a whole slew of others in fields like history and law and medicine to question the traditional attribution of the name Shakespeare to a man who had no proven education, whose family was illiterate, and who never actually claimed that he was the author. Once you start pointing this out to people, they're amazed. They say, really? Really? What? I don't understand that.
But it is the common tactic of the fascist tyrant to at first be completely dismissive. Well, there's no reason to even talk about that. To then next say, oh, it's dangerous.
Yeah,
that's dangerous. Like when you say you had colleagues who said, why are you leading them down this dangerous path? That sounds like, oh, it's dangerous to question the government. It's dangerous to question the empowered establishment.
Authority.
Yeah. And then the next phase of that becomes demonization.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's interesting. There is some progress to be made here. I can tell you of another colleague at my university in my department. He was born in England. He's taught courses in Shakespeare his whole life. And he attended a couple of the colloquia that I had. He attended certain of my classes. And he still looks at me and shakes his head and clucks and says, yeah, I'm not sure. But I recently read a book review that he wrote in some mainstream journal of something about Shakespeare and poetry or whatever. And I read his book review, and he wrote in the book review, William Shakespeare, whoever that entity might have been. And then he went on and wrote his review, and I thought, well, I think I've dented the consciousness a little bit if he can write whoever that entity might have been. The other thing that I've always been amused by is when you tell people who some of the authorship doubters are today and in the past, they're surprised. I mean, people know that Sir Derek Jacobi and Mark Rylance even Jeremy Irons. These are authorship doubters today. But, in Canada, we have our largest and most respected theater is the Stratford Shakespeare Festival. And the Stratford Shakespeare Festival was started by Sir Tyrone Guthrie in 1953. Guthrie was an authorship doubter. In his autobiography, he says, I have trouble believing that the man from Stratford could have written these plays. This is the man who started the Stratford Festival here. Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin, Mark Twain. People are astounded when they realize this is not a bunch of crackpots. These are some serious people out there.
You just listed the most prominent flat earthers, Holocaust deniers, UFO conspiracy theorists in the history of the world. That's that list that you just gave us there, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been called all of those things, by the way, by those who are so frightened and just absolutely react in such a knee-jerk emotional way as to go on the immediate attack just because you ask them to open their minds and ask questions.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mentioned Mark Rylance, the man who was the first artistic director of the rebuilt Globe Theatre in England. And this section that I did for Critical Stages, it opens with an interview between Mark Rylance and Derek Jacobi, two authorship doubters who are speaking to one another about something called the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. People can go online and find out about it. It's people who just say
we have a podcast episode on that same declaration.
Yeah, I mean, and all that Rylance and Jacobi are doing is saying, go to that Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, which simply says there seems to be a problem here, and if you believe we should talk about it, sign the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt. It's very reasonable. But the section in Critical Stages that I did, the very last piece that I included was a very recent interview that Mark Rylance did with BBC Radio. And Rylance, and nobody outside of the UK who happened to be listening on a given day had seen that interview. So I thought, okay, let me transcribe it and see if Rylance will let me publish it. And he did. And he says some really interesting things in it. One of the things that he says, and I'm quoting from his essay, he says, it's really just people who are defending Stratford and are frightened about Stratford, who say these things, and I think they're silly. I think, says Rylance, that the Birthplace Trust should have a coach that goes off every couple of days to visit the Earl of Oxford's house in Essex, or Gorhambury, where Sir Francis Bacon lived. The people in Stratford should welcome and explore this. That would be the behavior of a confident organization. Listen, we're confident in our position that the man from Stratford was the author, but we're delighted to have people with other ideas too, so go measure those ideas for yourself. But, says Rylance, the Stratford Birthplace Trust doesn't behave like that. They behave in a frightened, aggressive, and very insulting manner to people like myself and Sir Derek Jacobi and Professor William Leahy, who runs an MA course at Brunel University, where graduate students in London can study the authorship question. They are looking in those courses at the idolization of the author, how we have created an idol of the author, and whether that is revealing or obscuring the work. And I think Mark Rylance's words are very profound and very true. Let's open up the issue.
Well, I think that's one of the goals of this particular podcast series particularly is to try to open the issue to newcomers to the issue and to the question of authorship, as well as, of course, to direct them towards Edward de Vere, because obviously the podcast is sponsored by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and I obviously am an out Oxfordian. However, I do believe that there is value in researching every potential candidate. And I believe that through the research of some of the other candidates, we have learned more about how the works are tied to Oxford. And from an Oxfordian position, I see that research into Amelia Bassano, for instance, or research into the Earl of Derby, for instance, I think that some of those other candidates and their connections to Edward de Vere only prove even more so that Edward de Vere is the actual writer. And that's one of the reasons why I embrace further research into every and all candidate.
It's interesting you say that, Stephen, because in this issue of Critical Stages, I only push slightly two possible candidates. One of them is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and I happen to believe as well that he is the person who wrote these plays, but I'm not pushing that so hard for people who are just new to the question. But there is a whole section by a well-known actor and scholar named Hank Whittemore in Critical Stages, in which he talks about how theatrically full the life of the Earl of Oxford is, and I think it's very interesting. The other name that comes up in Critical Stages is an unusual name. It's the name of John Florio. Florio is not somebody who was taken at all seriously until, let's say, 5 or 8 years ago, when an Italian scholar and researcher named Lamberto Tassinari
all right, that's 5 for 5, Don. That's 5 really difficult names. That's 5 for 5. You're batting 1,000.
Well, Tassinari is focused as an Italian on the fact that of the 37 plays that were written under the name Shakespeare, more than a dozen of them were set in Italy. Now, you know, as a theater person, that if you want to be exotic and set a play in Nepal or Macau or something, you've never been there, you can Google some of these things and get a couple of references. But to do that a second time, a third time, a fourth time, Shakespeare of Stratford never left England. We know that because there's no records in the passport office that people would have to sign showing they left England. And more than a dozen of his plays are set in Italy. So people are looking at this question. The Earl of Oxford, of course, spent almost 2 years in Italy, traveling through Italy in places like Verona and Venice, all the places that are mentioned in the plays, but we're not talking about that. So what's happened here is that this Italian scholar, who, by the way, has moved to Montreal, Tassinari, has written a book, and the book is called John Florio, The Man Who Was Shakespeare. That book was translated into French about 2 years ago by the Secretary General of the International Association of Theater Critics, Michel Weiss. And you remember that this association is the publisher of the journal Critical Stages. So when I said I was going to do this issue on the authorship, Michel Weiss, the translator of this book on Florio, said, I would like to contribute an essay on why I believe, first of all, in the authorship issue, and second of all, that Florio, an Italian, was possibly the author. And I said, fine, I have no problem. So he wrote an essay which appeared in the journal in French on pourquoi John Florio, why John Florio. And he talks about his book being translated into France. Well, around the time that this issue came out a few months ago, Figaro, the major Paris newspaper, wrote a review of this book in French about John Florio, and the book attracted the attention of a number of French scholars who love to get into debates. And I can tell you right now, there's a half dozen major papers and a major authorship colloquium that have gone on and will be going on in France, pushing John Florio. So John Florio is in this issue of Critical Stages. If any of our listeners actually speak or read French, they can read the issue there. But the Florio book, The Man Who Was Shakespeare, also exists in English. And Florio is getting a big push right now in France from some very heavyweight scholars. I'm currently writing a play about the relationship between De Vere and Florio.
I was going to be my very next question is what is that connection? And there must be some.
There is a connection, but I don't think that Florio is the person who wrote the plays. And I'm going to be giving a paper on this at an upcoming conference on the relationship between the two. But in a nutshell, Florio was a classicist. Florio believed that tragedies needed to only be tragic, comedies only comic, and the whole thing that Shakespeare does throughout his plays of mixing genres should never happen. So anybody who's pushing Florio as the writer just has to read what Florio wrote on these issues, and they'll see that Florio could not be the author of the plays of Shakespeare. Florio was connected to the French ambassador to England. Florio had a lot of big connections with royalty at the time, and Florio and De Vere met on a number of occasions. But Florio, as best we know, never wrote a play. He wrote essays, he wrote books on how to teach Italian, and he wrote dialogues in those Italian teaching books. He wrote dialogues about theater and life in England at the time, the way language books sometimes do. But they're not plays. He's not the author. But there is a very interesting essay in this issue of Critical Stages about John Florio. And I learned a lot more about De Vere by researching Florio.
And see, there again is an incident where, and like I say, you're talking about what you mentioned, that Rylance's number one criticism of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is they don't behave as a confident organization. And whereas juxtaposed, Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship does behave as a confident organization, embracing all research into this topic, embracing all candidates, because inevitably what happens with each and every candidate on that rise to the top is that there is some connection, some documented connection to Edward de Vere or the life of Edward de Vere, and zero connection between any of these candidates and the man from Stratford.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on this, and I think that as people look into the issue for themselves, they will start to understand that there are a couple of bigger issues at play here. One of them being the financial interests that the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust has in keeping all the tourism bucks coming into Stratford. Rylance's position is let Stratford push tours to where De Vere was born, to where Francis Bacon was born, to wherever. That would show confidence. They're not really showing confidence at this particular point.
Yeah, and when it comes to the Italian plays, I always love how the Stratfordians, that's one place where suddenly their guy has all of the flaws that he doesn't have anywhere else, is when it comes to the Italian plays. And I love how when you point out to them, well, your man never went to Italy. Well, and that's why this is wrong in this Italian play, and this is wrong in this Italian play, and this is, he got all these things wrong in all these plays because he had never been there. And then you read Richard Rowe's book, Shakespeare's Guide to Italy, and you realize that no, he didn't get anything wrong. He got it absolutely correct, and in many ways so correct that it was impossible for anyone to have included these details who didn't actually visit the site. And that's, again, where they have to run away. They have to run and hide from the argument or attack and demonize because there's just no refuting the evidence.
I agree totally, and perhaps I should point out once again that in this issue that I was doing, I wasn't trying to push a specific name or a specific author, but I am rather simply trying to open the question about the possibility of pseudonymous writing in the case of the name William Shakespeare to a wider audience in the theater community through this particular journal, but hopefully to a wider audience in the academic community, hopefully to a wider public ultimately. But in this case, it was the theater community that I felt who might be open to the question. Certainly you put this issue to the people who teach in English departments. It's a closed issue. They won't talk about it. Lawyers talk about it. They're interested in evidence. Historians talk about it because they're interested in how truth changes over the course of history. Theater people, I think, will be interested in this question because it may help them see plays in a new way, give them ideas for new productions. And I think the responses that we've been getting that continue to come in and with the material that's going to be in the next issue will continue to open this dialogue to the theater community. That's your community, Stephen. That's my community. Let's see if that community is more open than some of the people who run through English departments.
What is the next step then for Critical Stages?
Well, as I say, we're going to publish a major essay responding to the section written by this Greek scholar who's a Shakespeare scholar, studied in England and is now back in Greece, saying that this is an important issue. And it's very rare, he says, to see it discussed in a mainstream journal. And he says, I don't understand why it's so rare. Let's open it up. Recently, Atlantic Magazine published a major piece suggesting that maybe Shakespeare was a woman. Let's just keep opening up those areas for discussion. I have my own idea who wrote the plays. We all do. But when there's an essay like that, could Shakespeare have been an Italian woman? An Italian? Could Shakespeare have been a Jewish Italian woman? I go right to those articles. I love to read them to see what kind of research was done. Now, that's pushing a particular name. Again, we have this two issues here. Number one, identifying the doubts that the man from Stratford could have written the plays. First, we have to open up that question. Once that question is opened up, then we move to the next question. Well, if he didn't, who did? And that's where I believe people like Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, will rise to the top, and we will all be running to books like Mark Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name to figure out who Edward de Vere was. That's the next step.
Well, then I guess what we're saying is in order to cure people of their Stratford addiction, we have to first get them to admit they have a problem.
Yeah. Well, isn't that what they say about any kind of addiction? First, you have to admit that there's a problem. And if you won't let go of your problem, if you won't acknowledge that your mind is closed, then you'll never take the next step. Let's get people off their addiction. Let's get people thinking in a much more open and free and exciting way.
Well, bravo, Don. I think that's a fabulous course for us all to take. And I know that the listeners of this podcast series are definitely of the inquiring mind type. That's why they're here, all of our fellow quillers, as I call them. And let's go out and quill it as much as we can by asking more and more questions. Thank you again for joining us for this episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, revealing the truth about Shakespeare authorship. Our special guest has been Don Rubin, professor of theater at York University in Toronto, Canada, and the series editor of 6-volume World Encyclopedia of Contemporary Theater, as well as the managing editor of Critical Stages. Find Critical Stages, critical-stages.org is where you can go for that. If you're looking for more information about the Shakespeare authorship question or Edward de Vere, please visit shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, your source and resource for everything you need to know about the SAQ and the Earl of Oxford. Please download other episodes of our podcast. And when you go to your download provider, make sure you give us a rate and a review. Tell the world how wonderful this show is. Get us up there to the top so we can spread this word to some others. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, as always, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.